Hi, this is Kelsey Fukowski for AP Gov Review, Unit 2, Part 2, dealing with political opinion, political action, and in this video we're going to be looking at voting demographics. First, let me ask you and take a moment to look at some of these topics that appear in front of your screen. Where do you stand on some of these issues? Whether it is affirmative action, is it healthcare, nuclear weapons, immigration? Take a moment and think about that, and then ask yourself the following question. Did you really come up with this stance on your own? Chances are, even though you might think you are an independent thinker and you came up with this stance all by yourself, probably you did not, because Americans are what we call, along with everybody else who develops some type of political belief, are politically socialized. And by definition, this refers to the process through which an individual acquires their political orientation. So basically, how do you come to the beliefs that you have today? And as you get older, especially as you're going to be more impacted by politics, your orientation grows firmer, meaning it's going to grow stronger. You're not going to waver as much. You're not going to go back and forth. Typically by 40, 50, 60 years of age, you're not going to be switching political parties or political beliefs in that regard. So the end result is your political opinion, basically where you stand on this. And most of the time where you come up with your orientation, it's done informally. You might be absorbing it from watching television. You might be acquiring it from listening to your parents. So these are different ways in which you are politically socialized. The biggest impact is the family. Chances are the political belief that you have right now is very similar to what your parents have. So the family is certainly the biggest impact for children. It makes sense because your parents typically are the ones who are going to be most influential in your life. They're going to be the ones talking politics, maybe at the dinner table, or maybe even discussing it at a party, or maybe putting on a certain channel of the news in which they're talking about politics, in which your orientation is going to be impacted toward what your parents might be listening to or discussing. So how party identification is passed down from one generation to the next? Well, if you look, if both parents are Democrats, then you have a 59% chance of being a Democrat yourself. If both parents are independent, look, 67% are most likely to be independent. If both parents are Republican, 59%. Of course, by no means does this mean automatically 100%, but we're talking in general terms that you have a much higher chance. It almost has about a 2/3 predictor that you will have the same political beliefs as your parents. Now, when we talk about the process of political socialization, one of the chief sources of information for children is the media, and we call this a linkage institution. We will certainly have an entire chapter on the media and linkage institutions, but essentially this is going to connect voters, even children who are not voting age yet, but they're going to be connecting them to the political process, whether that's watching the television news, listening to the radio, reading the newspaper. While schools are not a linkage institution, it is a way that the government can socialize young people into the political culture. Many states offer civics, or just by taking this elective, this is how you are also getting politically socialized, as you are going to be better educated about the voting process, about your government. And studies undoubtedly show that if you take a class in civics during your high school year, you are much more likely to vote, and you're going to be much more knowledgeable about politics and policy for the remainder of your life. And that certainly is very good. Now, where some critics come in, there is a liberalizing effect of college. Colleges have been known to lean more to the left and espouse more liberal democratic policies, especially at the college level. However, when we look at really high school level, you don't really see so much of a liberalizing effect because it's really more focused on just education about your government, not so much, whether liberals or conservatives are better or which one has a better policy. So keep that in mind. Now, aging increases political participation and the strength of your party attachment over time. Now, if you look at this group of demographics here, 18 to 20, only 17% showed up for the 2006 congressional elections. Yet notice how that percentage significantly is going to increase, especially in the 55 to 84 demographics here, where you have between 60 to 62% of people showing up to the polls. Yet, notice it is a steady increase over time because you're going to be more impacted by politics. You're going to see that impact much more significantly, especially when it comes to healthcare, Medicare, Social Security, income taxes, all that stuff. That's going to increase political participation. And not to mention, too, at these ages, you might be retired, you have more time in your hands, which means you are more likely to vote as well. So, political ideologies, there are a ton of them, but we're going to really look at just a few of them. So when we talk about an ideology, we're talking about a coherent set of beliefs about politics, public policy, and public purpose. Really, where do you stand? What are your beliefs? So really the two major camps are the liberals and conservatives. These are really the predominance of this. When you survey Americans, typically 38% are conservatives, 24% are liberals, 38% are moderates. So they can really be swayed in many ways. So keep that in mind as well. Now, when we talk about a gender gap, you'll probably see that, where when we look at women compared to men, women tend to be less conservative. There's where that gender gap falls with conservatives as opposed to liberals. But really, your ideology, whether you're a liberal or conservative, is going to be contingent upon many factors. If you're a person who believes that you should have unlimited personal freedom and you should have unlimited economic freedom, for example, there should be no taxes and freedom of speech should be unlimited, you might fall into the libertarian camp. So if you're a Ron Paul supporter, a Rand Paul supporter, you would certainly fall up here. But if you're somebody who believes in lower taxes, but really with personal freedom in terms of, let's say, flag burning, you don't think flag burning should be done because it erodes, in your opinion, patriotism, and you want to restrict that, well, then you might be more conservative. And again, that's a very simplistic and broad example there. But you also have your leftists, which falls into socialism, and then you also have statists, which you really don't see that much today. But nevertheless, really focus on the major components of what distinguishes a liberal from a conservative and vice versa. When we look at military spending, typically conservatives are going to want to have a larger military. They're more likely to be okay with spending tax money on building up the military. Whereas with liberals, they're going to talk about spending less and using that extra money towards something else. A big issue too, when we talk about social policy, conservatives really tend to really hate abortion. They support right to life movements, whereas with liberals, they support freedom of choice. When we look at economic policy, certainly liberals are going to want the government to tax the rich more. They want to have more social programs, whereas conservatives are going to favor free market solutions. Work hard. Really, that's where you have that individualistic component of American political culture. So if you work hard, you will, make it in life. They also want to keep taxes low, and they want to also keep spending low on most things aside from the military. So these are very important that you are able to distinguish as to the particular tenets that I had just discussed. Now, when we look at influences on political socialization, major events such as the New Deal or 9/11 can impact, your stance on politics. A good example of this is George W. Bush, who had a very low approval rating when he left office in 2008. Actually had about a 70% approval rating following 9/11. So you actually had Democrats and you had moderates really going over and staunchly supporting George Bush after 9/11. So there are political events that can shift your thinking. Also, religion can also impact. Generally speaking, Catholics and Jews tend to be a little bit more liberal, whereas Protestants and evangelicals tend to be more conservative. When you look at occupations, professors and lawyers tend to be liberal, where people might, in the construction field or in the oil industry, tend to be conservative. And there are just a number of different factors that really, where you group voters by ideology, it's quite interesting. Again, it's not a precise science, but generally speaking, it is correct. In the Northeast, you typically are going to have more liberals, especially on the West Coast and in the Northeast, whereas you tend to find more conservatives in the South or the Bible Belt region, as well as the Midwest, as seen in these darker shades of green here. Now let me run down this really quickly. When we talk about social class, typically the working class or blue collar tend to be vote Democratic, and you also tend to see middle class and white collar people tend to be actually split between Republicans and Democrats. But really, when you look at the upper class, the top 5-10% tend to be more Republican, as the Republican Party tends to be more pro-business. So that makes more sense as to why they might lean that particular way. When we look at race and ethnicity, that is important to know, especially for the AP Gov exam. Whites tend to vote more Republican, blacks tend to vote more Democratic, Hispanics also tend to vote more Democratic, and Asians actually tend to vote more Republican, as that is part of their conservative culture. So again, we are talking about voting blocks here, where these are typically strongholds for the respective parties or ideologies, and for the most part, these have really not wavered all that much, and it's a particular concern, especially for the Republican Party, to capture that Hispanic vote, as that's going to be pivotal in the next few elections, as Hispanics become a majority in the United States. Now, when we look at age, youth tend to be more liberal. That does make sense. They are actually least likely at the same time to vote because they're not as politically engaged. Whereas when we look at the elderly, they are more likely to be conservative, and they are also more likely to participate. You have more time, you can certainly vote at the polls. Education, typically the more educated you are, the more liberal you are. When we talk about gender, we mentioned the gender gap earlier. Women tend to, of course, be more liberal as opposed to men. And the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be conservative. And in terms of minorities, they tend to be more liberal as well. And again, this page sort of reiterates what I just said as to the voting influences. So there are many, many factors that are going to impact you. Just to mention this, just as a sidebar, that again, aside from liberal and conservative ideologies, you also have libertarians and socialists. When we talk about libertarians, they support individual liberties and a strict limitation on government. They believe less government, the better in every respect. When we talk about socialism, we're talking really about government ownership of public entities, where the state is basically the means of production. They support also greater equality of property rights. They're also going to support things like universal health care, free college for people who are college bound. So they certainly are going to support greater involvement of federal government. Ultimately, the defining issues for ideologies tend to be civil rights, and that's more historically speaking, economics, and then public and personal issues. And especially the last one, public and personal issues. There might be a specific issue from the death penalty to abortion that might ultimately define whether or not you are a conservative, or you're a liberal, or you're a libertarian. So that's important to keep in mind, that ultimately it comes down to these three broad issues. So let's review for our final slide here. Take a moment to read this. So a member of which of the following demographic groups is most likely to support a Republican presidential candidate? Take a moment to look at the choices. And if you said a white male, you would be correct. And I don't know why this had appeared, some formatting issue, but nevertheless, it would not be a white female, because remember we talked about the gender gap, and typically females are less likely to be Republican as opposed to males. Also, African Americans tend to be a major voting bloc for Democrats or also liberals. Youths under the age of 25, again, younger you are, typically the more likely you are to be a liberal or Democrat. And then individuals earning below poverty level wages, male or female, when you are of that lower economic means, you also tend to be more liberal, or more likely to be a Democrat. So the best answer here is a white male. Males tend to be more conservative, as do whites. So A is the correct answer. So if you got that, kudos to you.